Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Want to welcome you to today's session of Trauma-Informed Practices, Returning to In-Person School in the Fall, secondary focus session. My name is Maria Carrillo. I'm the Administrative Assistant for the Office of Education Solutions, which is within the School of Education here at Metropolitan State University. I'd like to introduce our two presenters for today, the first being Dr. Ellie Cahill and Dr. Laura MacArthur. So I will pass it on to them, and I will be working behind the scenes, answering questions or alerting the presenters that there is a question. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Maria, for that kind introduction. So I am Dr. Ellie Cahill. I am one of the co-founders of Resilient Futures. I have been working with trauma-impacted children and families for many, many years now. But what is relevant to share is that I actually came to this career first as an educator. And so I was a high school language arts teacher for a number of years before I shifted careers and pursued my clinical experience, which brings me to the work that I do today. Laura?
Hi, everyone. I'm Laura MacArthur. I'm another co-founder of Resilient Futures, and many of you may know our third co-founder, Megan Brennan, who does a lot of these workshops throughout the year. So I'm also someone who's been working in trauma-informed clinical work and schools work for many years, and really excited to think with you today about what it's going to be like, as we return to quote unquote sort of normal, in-person school this fall, and just thinking about the impact of this last year and a quarter on where we're all at right now. So thanks for being here. This is a recorded webinar, so please do utilize the Q&A. And we know that this isn't the most interactive format, but we wanted to use the webinar format so that others can watch who can't make it, but so that that also protects the privacy of those who are here. So hopefully if you have questions or things you want to kind of share out, please use the Q&A. And we're really here kind of in thinking with you about the lens of being a pre-service teacher and what it's going to be like to go into these schools for field placements or student teaching in this very unique time that we're in.
So just to give you a little sense of how we will spend our day. So we encourage you to do whatever you need to do, obviously to feel comfortable and, settles. We'll be with you. We have a 90-minute block of time set aside, but we're going to be delivering content for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will have a chance to answer questions that you have. But that said, as Laura said, please, if you have questions as we are going along, drop them in the Q&A section, and we will be paying attention. If there's something that we would like to address sooner, we will do that. But yeah, we will begin formally at this point in time.
So I want to start with the land acknowledgement. We are, gathered here through our, Metro State partnership. And so we want to acknowledge in particular the Indigenous people on land of Auraria and the broader Denver area as well. And so as we gather here virtually today, I know we're maybe very spread out, and we want to honor and acknowledge that the MSU rests on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations in particular, and that this area was also the site of trade and hunting and gathering and healing for many other Native nations, in particular for where we are, the Lakota, Ute, Kiowa, Comanche, Apache, Shoshone, and other Native nations. So we ask you to just join us as we recognize these Indigenous peoples as the original stewards of this land, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. And we know that the land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities. So we just want to take this moment to honor these ancestral grounds wherever you may be, and in particular the MSU campus, and celebrate the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Thank you.
So to talk for a minute about where we are going today, this is a little bit of the roadmap of where we're headed. We're going to hopefully gain an understanding of the current context of returning to in-person learning for your secondary students, just given COVID, given where we are still in the world, how that reentry might look like. We will do a brief review of that biological response to stress and trauma that will frame and guide your understanding of how your students and how you might be showing up yourself. And we'll also look at the lens of cultural humility to explore that intersection of equity with the COVID-19 pandemic and how the disparities have been magnified in equity focus. And finally, we will lean into trauma-informed practices grounded in the 3 C's of resilience to support this transition back to school.
So to start, I just want to bring you back to maybe one of the first things you may have heard when you first started learning about trauma-informed practices, which is this shift in our mindset, moving from asking what's wrong with you to what has happened to you. And a reminder here, we're not saying, this is a question you might actually ask on a regular basis, but that it shifts the way that you think about, interactions and experiences you might be having with students or colleagues, other professionals, that you're working with. So, the exciting thing about this phrase right now is that now there's a book. So there's Bruce Perry and Oprah have written this book called What's Happened to You, or What Happens to You, to really kind of dig into what this mindset shift is all about and how we can really use it to understand, how people are showing up and how they've been impacted by stress and trauma.
So related to that piece around what has happened to you, we really want to emphasize that the context really matters. And so leaning into thinking about, for many of you as pre-service educators, if this is the first time being in a field placement, really recognizing the backdrop that you are entering that space with. And I wouldn't say first and foremost, because the first 2 top really are intersected. But we really need to recognize the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of your students may have gone back for a part of the year, but there are going to be a number of students that are entering in-person learning for the first time in a really long time. And so just being aware of what that isolation might have been like for them, and that longing for connection with friends, and just what that experience is like. And while it might be something that you have students who are really excited for, there's also anxiety and stress that come with that. So recognizing that a lot has happened to the children and families that you are serving, and that within that, there's going to be a lot of loss too. Many children and families, and maybe even your own experiences, have lost loved ones in the COVID-19 pandemic, or had family members who got quite ill. So thinking about all of those things, or who are, depending on where you are in the process of maybe just vaccinated, not yet vaccinated, kind of all of those pieces of where are we at in this process. Along with that is often Laura and I speak about the racial injustice as a racism pandemic. It's not new. This is not something we know that racism has existed in our country for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is not new, but what is new is this magnification of racism that has emerged during the pandemic. And so there is this way that we know that children and families have been stressed in unbelievable and profound ways. And that doesn't go away when we go back to school. When we start to return to our in-person ways of being, there's a lot of shrapnel that comes from those experiences that children and families will bring into those spaces, and a lot of resiliency. So naming that there's trauma, but there's a lot of resiliency and strength that you will also see in your classrooms. And we want to take a minute to acknowledge that you are, so back when I was a teacher and I was an educator, one of the things that we really spent a lot of time talking about was the fact that being an educator is a reciprocal process. So you are changed as much as your children and the students you serve are changed in those interactions. And so how you show up and your experiences are also really important. So when we have that question, what has happened to you? We're talking not just about the children and families, but you as well. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes for you. We're thinking about what's showing up for you now. So as you think about your field placement, student teaching's hard. I've been there. It's frightening, it's stressful, it's exciting, but there's a lot of anxiety that can happen when you think about what is it like to share leadership with your mentor or cooperating teacher? What is it like to think about engaging with students and planning and prep and all of these things that you've learned theoretically and really doing these field placements in person? And so as much as you are, it's what we look forward to, right? When we are becoming educators, these opportunities, it can come with some stress and anxiety. So given that, we're going to just give you a few minutes to, hopefully if you have something to journal with or write, we're going to give you a few minutes, just 3 minutes, to think about what was your own personal experience during this past year. So what were the things that really challenged you? What were those experiences that caused you a lot of stress? Maybe experiences that made it feel like I don't quite have the capacity to cope with this. And what were those experiences that you learned things about yourself that surprised you? Maybe gratitude that you have developed coming out of the pandemic. Maybe sources of resiliency in yourself that you didn't realize that you had. And then also, given where have you come from? How are you entering? What were your experiences like? I'm going to ask that you consider what's coming up for you when you think about that upcoming year. So what are the things that you might be worried about that might show up in the classroom? And then what are things that you are really looking forward to? So we're just going to give you, I'm going to set a timer for about 3 minutes and just invite you to journal right now about those questions. So now we just ask that you finish up your thoughts, and hopefully that moment, that short, brief time to pause, to reflect, to name some of the experiences that you're bringing and maybe some of your concerns will bring a little bit more clarity that will help you enter into your teaching experience with a little bit more focus and resiliency as you better understand how you're approaching this year.
Thanks, Sally. We often ask for folks to pause and journal and reflect as part of our core tenet around cultural humility. So if you've been through some of our trainings before, you've heard this term, and I'm just going to kind of walk through it right now and link it to this quote here, which is that traumatic experiences are realities that students face. However, they often can be overlooked or not believed by adults because it doesn't make sense based on the adult's perspective of the world or the experience that the adult has faced. And this really gets at the core piece of cultural humility, which is willing to hear and be changed by someone else's perspective. And there are three pieces to it. The first being lifelong learning and self-reflection, which is, part of that piece we just gave you a few minutes for, to really just notice what's coming up for you. What kind of space are you in as you're entering the school year? The second piece is recognizing and challenging power imbalances. And so when you have a good handle on kind of how you're entering a space and you're noticing maybe an experience like this where a student's telling you something that you're like, I don't know, that doesn't sound right, right? Can you notice when that's happening and noticing your power as the adult in that situation and what you can offer to a student in just hearing them and just believing what they're telling you? And the final piece of cultural humility is institutional accountability. And this is where, we hope we, see schools, for example, really come together and think about the ways in which the institution can do better together, can hold themselves accountable for some of the ways in which trauma and re-traumatization shows up in schools. So these are very linked. To be trauma informed and to practice cultural humility as a teacher, it's such a gift for the students in your classroom and for your colleagues as well, to just know that, you're going to hear things, and some of them are going to be tough, and you have a place for those things to land, for students to engage with you in that way and know that they're going to be believed.
So related to that piece that everyone's experience is different and unique, we want to review the 3 E's that we think about when we think about trauma. So we're really recognizing that individual trauma results from an event or a series of events. So something that happens, a set of circumstances that's experienced by an individual as either physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. And so what we mean by that is it may not physically harm them, but if there is a perception that it can harm us and there's a threat that can harm us, that can have lasting adverse effects on our functioning. So our physical functioning, social, emotional, spiritual well-being. So our minds, bodies, and spirits are impacted by trauma. And the piece about lasting adverse effects, that's really we're talking about when trauma is not addressed. It can lead to those lasting adverse effects. So what we're really saying is it's important to recognize that there are lots of different experiences that can lead to an experience of trauma. So it could be living in chronic poverty. It could be experiencing abuse or neglect. It could be experiencing being in an accident. It could be experiencing grief and loss, racism, xenophobia, cisgenderism. There are so many ways that people can experience trauma, but every person's experience is subjective. So what I mean by that is I could have an experience that is extremely traumatic to me. So maybe I'm in a car accident and I end up with very strong traumatic stress responses. And maybe Laura has that same experience of being in that same accident. Maybe she's in the other car, and based on her ability to cope in that moment, maybe she does not have perceive that and experience that as a trauma. So it really is about each of us experience something different related to our capacity to cope in those moments. And so that's that piece that Laura's talking about, that we really need to recognize, even if something doesn't sound to us as if it's traumatic, we really have to believe the children and families that we work with and recognize that they are living an experience that is very real.
So related, to this experience of trauma and also including, stress, one of the things that may happen is that our window of tolerance, is impacted by the experiences that we live through, the events that we live through. And so if you are a kid who's been in a family where you've been really significantly impacted by COVID-19, for example, and that could be for a lot of different reasons, your window of tolerance might be smaller than it was the last school year, or the before the pandemic. So the window of tolerance is, this place where we can manage our feelings and manage our responses. We can think through things kind of, in that clear sort of frontal lobe type of way. And it can be kind of different day to day, but it's also, impacted by these experiences that we have. So, for example, as my window of tolerance gets more narrow, based on maybe I didn't sleep well, maybe I haven't eaten yet today, maybe I'm going through something really stressful in my personal life, that window of optimum arousal is going to get narrow. And I'm going to more quickly go into a hyperarousal or hypoarousal kind of state. And this is our body taking care of us, right? This is our stress response working the way it's supposed to, but it doesn't necessarily make it easy for us, right? Because this is happening all the time. And so the students, the colleagues, the mentor teachers, the caregivers, all these folks that we're interacting with are also experiencing different kinds of stress and events in their lives. And all of our windows of tolerance might be interacting with each other. So I just want to be aware, like, oh, I'm entering this space maybe with a more narrow window than I have before. And how do I want to think about that? Am I a person who tends to go into the hyperarousal state where I get panicky and anxious and agitated? Or am I a person that kind of shuts down, right? Do I go more into that hypoarousal state when my window gets narrow, more likely to feel kind of numb and just, have poor boundaries and kind of shut down. So there are different responses we might have. And all of it really is, like I said, our stress response trying to take care of us, in this, whatever this difficult moment or whatever the moment is that's popped up where everything has kind of piled on in that moment.
We're going to give you another opportunity for self-reflection. And we really want you to think about what impacts your own window of tolerance. So for example, for me, I tend to be more likely to be in that optimal arousal when I'm practicing on a regular basis. So when I'm spending time, I walk every day. When I'm spending time in nature walking in that, and we kind of know, right? Bruce Perry talks about pattern repetitive movement, like walking or running or exercise, helps us be more regulated. So for me, if I'm in accessing my own meditation and mindfulness and time spent in nature, my window of tolerance is larger. When I'm more tired, it definitely narrows. And the other thing I notice is if the threat, whatever it might be, if there's a perceived threat that I'm experiencing and it's about my children, like my babies, then for me, that's when I find myself less likely to stay in that window of tolerance, because for me, a threat to my children is something that really, really, it's a significant concern that rises for me. And so there might be the context, and it might also be what are practices that you're engaging with that impact your window. And so what is your response when you are outside of that optimal arousal that Laura's talking about? And how do you widen your window of tolerance? So the more likely we are to stay in that kind of robust window of tolerance, right, that our window of that optimal arousal, the more likely we are to kind of be able to fall more readily back into that state. So we're going to give you maybe just a minute to jot down some thoughts for yourself around what are those things that impact your window? And how might that play out as you think about, as excited as you are, a new stressor of moving into a field placement? I'm just going to give you a minute to jot down some thoughts for yourself. And as you're thinking about widening your window, you can think about practices that you can engage in, but also think about community care. We talk a lot about self-care, but who else can support you to increasing your own window, right? Because we also know, in a little bit of review, that we're more readily able to come to a state of calm when someone else helps us with co-regulation than when we try to rely only on ourselves. So who else are the supports available to you? So since this is a webinar format, it's hard to know how much time people need. So we're going to move on, but please continue to journal about these later if you felt like, oh, that wasn't enough time.
Definitely. So just to connect this all to the adolescent brain for a minute so that we can really also be thinking about the students that you're going to be working with this year and what's happening for them in their brain development and how might they especially be impacted by stress and trauma. So we know that the adolescent brain is just so sensitive to experience. It's just like early childhood, kind of happening again, where all kinds of new connections are being made, more pruning is happening, so the connections are getting strengthened. And it's kind of like one of the interesting things about it is that it's why humans tend to remember even the most mundane events from adolescence much better than even important events in later life. It's because it's such an important window for learning that sticks. And so this is just great for us to know when we're working with adolescents, right? Because stress and trauma also have a really big impact then on the adolescent brain, as does healing and resilience. So the opportunities that adolescents get to build new relationships, to understand how to be in relationship with others, to learn coping skills, which we'll talk about a little bit later. These are things that are going to stick with them. And so it's just a great reminder for us that part of what we can do when we're working with adolescents is really notice, their stress level, right? Stress takes more years off of your life if you're a teenager than if you're an adult. It's a really vulnerable time, but it's also a really powerful time to build strong, healthy connections as well.
So we want to take a minute, and this may be a little bit of new content, not as much of a review, but we want to talk for a minute about how is it that our nervous systems really know when an environment is safe or dangerous or life-threatening. And it's really it's a term that we use that's called neuroception, which is a term developed by a professor of psychiatry and the director of the Brain Body Center at the University of Illinois at Chicago, Dr. Stephen Porges. And he really coined that term, which describes the way that our neural circuits in our brain make sense of information. So it's really how our brain lets us know if a situation is safe, if it's dangerous, or if it's life-threatening. So this is operating on a subconscious level. It's not something we're consciously aware of, but it really means that if it's allowing us to be aware of danger that we wouldn't know that on a cognitive level. So it's really this neurophysiological experience that happens in our brains and in our bodies. So kind of how does that work? Really, there's specific areas in the brain, so our temporal lobe of the cortex, so kind of the front part of our brain, that detect and evaluate features that exist. So people's facial expressions, their body language, their movements, how they vocalize, and all of those things contribute on this neurological level to an impression of whether something is safe or trustworthy. So there's an area in the cortex that actually becomes activated when we see familiar faces and when we hear voices that are familiar to us. So if neuroception identifies that a situation is safe, then our neural circuits that tend to inhibit the area of fight, flight, freeze, that trauma response, come on board. And so we engage in relationships, we engage in strong bonds and social opportunities if we detect that, yeah, it's a safe place to do that. We're really social. And children, particularly in adolescence, are extremely social as well. And so what that means also is that our neuroception is really attuned to the state of others. So if we think about a classroom where a lot of students are struggling with and feeling dysregulated, then we're going to read that as our neural circuits are going to read that as not safe. And this is really about survival, right? This is primitive. This is about how we survive. But if we sense calm around us, then, and that's shared by a group, then we're more likely able to be in a state of calm. So the key point to remember about this is that we have to have that neuroception of safety. We have to read a situation on that deep physiological, neurological level as safe in order to engage socially, which means in order to learn, in order to be in a classroom. And so safety, one of our core guiding principles is safety and predictability. That's why this safety is so important. And for you as a pre-service educator, it's thinking about how can I create a classroom space where the climate is going to send those signals to my students so that they can read the situation as safe. And there's a whole equity piece too, recognizing that how do we make differences really help our students recognize that difference is safe and difference is okay, and really creating that context so that your students are open to learning.
Yes, absolutely. So we're always, going into sort of a school year pre-pandemic, thinking about creating that safety for students to engage socially and learn, is important every year. And now this year, it's even more important because we know that kids are coming back to school with very different experiences. As Ellie was talking about earlier, some may have really experienced significant trauma over the last year, whereas others maybe haven't. And so there's going to be a wide variety of experiences over the last year, and a wide variety of needs for safety. So, what are we going to do to sort of learn what their experience was, right? Did they go through, loss and grief, for example? Did they have challenges with healthcare, housing, support systems, financial stressors? All of those issues that came up during COVID were actually exacerbated by already existing racial disparities. So we know that families who maybe had struggles in those areas before likely had more and more of those throughout the last year and a quarter. So we have to really be aware of this context and kind of thinking about what we expect kids to come in with. Like, we often have these expectations, right, of what's acceptable or what's normal in their behavior. And we just really need to be looking at our own biases and kind of questioning that a little bit. Like, what would be normal for a kid to come in with after their experiences this year? We don't know. We don't know until we know their experiences, until we know, maybe they experienced racism, witnessed, serious racism in their community, and that has exacerbated their stress response, right? And they're more likely to go into hyperarousal. Or maybe they didn't get healthcare this year. Maybe their family lost healthcare and they weren't able to get treated for, some sort of medical or physical health need. And that's exacerbated, their window of tolerance. So there's a lot of different pieces to consider here. And just remembering that this context really matters, especially as we approach how to create safety in our classrooms.
So related to this, we really also wanted to spend a little bit of time and talk about some of the experiences of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community with COVID and the magnification of racism in our country. We know that a high proportion of Asian Americans work in essential positions that are high contact occupations. So maybe healthcare, so nurses, physicians, healthcare technologists, people working in the food service industry as well. So food preparation, supervisors, et cetera. And those are the kinds of positions that we also know increase the risk for COVID-19 exposure and infection. So we are aware that throughout the pandemic, there are certain populations that have really been exposed at much higher rates than other populations because of their occupations. We also know that the Asian American business community has really sustained, honestly, some of COVID-19's worst economic impacts. So we know, so there's according to research by McKinsey and Company, Asian-owned businesses make up large percentages of the sectors that have been hit hardest by COVID-19. So accommodations, food service industries, educational service businesses, retail. And so this impact has been profound, but it hasn't only been profound on the level of exposure to COVID or economic impact. There has been significant escalations in anti-Asian xenophobia and racism that has profoundly impacted the community through hate crimes. As the slide says, have increased by 150% in 2020. According to the Pew Research, between March of 2020 and May of 2020, so right in the beginning as the pandemic emerged, there were 1,800 racist incidents targeting Asian Americans. So a profound increase in just that short window. And we know that there is a fear of just physical safety that has impacted our AAPI communities. And so just recognizing what is that like for students as they show up in your classroom. The significant fear around just being in community where there is still increased targeting. And so that process of returning to school in person, going back to school, being in the hallways, all of those experiences, as we think about any of our communities of color, but in particular thinking about how this community has been profoundly impacted. There is the Stop AAPI Hate is a coalition that does track incidents of violence and harassment. So if you want to know more about these experiences and the data that is informing this urgency to support this community, I recommend that you look at that resource.
So, we know that many communities, have been faced with all kinds of stressors this year related to racism. And one of the ways that racism and racial trauma, shows up is through microaggressions. And microaggressions are these like subtle insults, verbal or nonverbal, directed towards people of color that happen, often automatically or unconsciously. And they build up over time, right? So even if they are a brief kind of event, they are brief, everyday, commonplace exchanges that send denigrating messages to people of color because they belong to a racial minority group. So one of the things we want to think about is, what can we do and who do we talk to? How should we interact with students if we've heard something that feels demeaning, maybe that they've said to another student or something that an adult has said to them? The power of language, is just cannot be understated. And so even when we don't know sort of what to do in the moment, it's worth thinking about how do we make steps in the future. Our stress response is often activated when we witness a microaggression or if we enact one. They often come out when we are under stress. So again, back to like how we have these needs for safety, and how do we create places that are safe for kids to name when these things happen. Kids know when these things are happening, and what can we do to show up for them and for ourselves and our colleagues? So I just want to take a minute for you to think about who can you talk to if you notice something, an insult directed at a student in a class, and or you hear about something, they tell you about something that's happened. What can you do and who can you talk to? I think those are sort of two related questions, right? Because sometimes we don't know what to do or what we can do depending on the position we're in someone else's classroom or, a school where we're sort of just brand new and entering the space. And so it's really important to identify who can we talk to sort of figure that out, right? How do we identify some of our own biases and things that come up when we are witnessing or exposed to these events, and how do we continue to improve? So back to that lifelong learning, right? These are moments of critical self-reflection to understand that we need to kind of stop, reflect on this situation, and wonder about it and wonder what we can do about it. So yeah, I just want to give you a minute to kind of identify what are some steps you could take and who could you talk to? And if that's hard to identify, that's a good thing to know, because you're going to want to find those people. You're going to want to, if this is a new teacher relationship, you're not sure yet if that's a person you can talk to, you're going to want to kind of feel that out. Or if it's someone outside of your, education system, who are those people? It's really going to be important to have, someone that you can reflect and observe, kind of your own patterns and your own responses when these things happen. See what will happen.
So we want to also spend a little bit of time really recognizing how has COVID-19 impacted secondary students. So in July of 2020, Youth Truth released a survey. It's the students weigh in Learning and Well-Being During COVID-19. And it was a national report that looked at insights from over 20,000 students about their learning, about their well-being during the first wave of school closures that we experienced. And this report was meant to be a one-time thing, but they are going to continue these reports, especially recognizing that as the pandemic evolves, students are still continuing to navigate so many changes in their communities. But some of the data that they heard, you'll see on the slide, is that 46% of the students surveyed nationally reported feelings of depression, stress, or anxiety in the fall of 2020. So in this survey, they looked at 952 schools across 37 states. So pretty big study, and found that nearly half of the students were saying, I'm depressed, stressed, or anxious. And so we want to take a minute to also name that this is, across the board population of students. But if you are placed in a school that are historically has higher rates of maybe trauma in the community, or a group of students that are more frequently targeted, have identities that are targeted identities of oppression, those numbers at 46% is probably much higher. So you might be entering a school community where many of your students are feeling overwhelmed, are feeling depressed, are feeling stressed and anxious. And so we want to recognize that is going to be a big part of how do you go into a classroom knowing that that's the context, not pathologizing your students, but being aware of and sensitive to there's a heightened stress and anxiety that we have not seen historically, that we have not seen historically. So we know that this is happening for kids, for your students. And how do you still continue to provide them a context that's safe, that you develop those relationships, and that you also ultimately engage them in the rigorous education that they deserve. We also know, based on this same study, that obstacles to learning have also been found. So Latinx, multiracial, and Black students were more likely to report that they had obstacles to learning than their white or Asian counterparts. And we name that because it's important to recognize some disparities, but also name that just because a student isn't reporting, your white or Asian American students aren't reporting obstacles to learning, doesn't mean that they are not significantly impacted by COVID-19. As we just talked about with the racialized trauma in the AAPI community. So some of the other things that came out of the study that students were reporting for those obstacles to learning, they were feeling distracted by home and family responsibilities. So 44% of the students surveyed said that's part of the obstacle was I just have a lot that I'm taking care of. They were concerned about the health of themselves or family members. So 28% reported that concern. 26% reported that they had limited or no internet access. So really thinking about, yes, we're returning back to in-person learning, but many students didn't have access in the same way to the learning that was offered in the last school year because of that limited resource. 20% reported not having an adult who could help them with their schoolwork. 18% reported their personal experiences were obstacles. 17% said they had out-of-school extracurricular commitments, so other things that they were doing. So all of those things. And then we had students reporting that they didn't feel safe at school or at home. So really recognizing that all of these factors, there were obstacles that really impacted a child's ability to learn. And so recognizing that, what is it going to be like coming back? And some of those obstacles are related to COVID-19 and some may not be. So also recognizing that there are children and families that are still going to be impacted by limited internet access, or are still going to have maybe not an adult that can help them with their homework. And so we want to recognize that while these are pronounced in COVID-19, the students that you serve are still going to have some of these same issues even when they return to in-person learning.
So a couple other things that came out of that study. With so many students, citing depression and stress and anxiety as, such a big issue right now, the need for emotional and mental health support for students and educators is greater than ever. And what we're seeing is, some shifts here and some interesting trends. So about 41% of students in fall of 2020 reported that there's an adult at school that they could talk to about their stress or their emotional experience. Whereas before COVID, that number was a bit higher, 46%. And then sort of on the flip side, what we're seeing is that schools are really trying hard to, increase their offerings of programs and services that will help students and families. And, I was just on a call with an educator prior to this meeting where we were talking about what's going to stay the same. And her first response was the food bank. Like, they started it during COVID. It's been a huge source of support for students and their families. And it's not going to go away, right? That there have been some things that we've put in place or that we're doing now in response to COVID that hopefully will increase that support. So we'll get that number back up where students are able to identify an adult in school that they can talk to, that they can go to.
So while we are naming this increase in anxiety and the ways that schools are responding to provide as much support as they can, we also know that in the state of Colorado, medical experts are really saying that we are in a youth mental health state of emergency. And so what that means is that there are not enough services at present to go around. Children's Hospital has reported a 90% increase in mental health emergency room visits, in particular with children coming for suicidal ideation. That said, there is a wait list at Children's of 10 to 12 months for children to have access to an anxiety clinic and things like that, because the need is so profound. Many mental health providers who work outpatient are also citing being overrun with the need for services. So really recognizing that there is a great deal of need and unfortunately not all of the resources that we wish we had available. At Children's Hospital, the Chief Medical Officer, David Bromberg, said in an interview, referring to his more than 20 years in practice, "I've never seen anything like the demand we've seen for mental health services at Children's in the last 15 months, but most acutely in the last 3 to 4 months." So really sitting in the space that people are hurting. And there's a lot of woundedness in the world. And with that, children, your students may be entering feeling really unprepared to return to normal because this disruption has lasted for a really long time. So what does that mean for you as educators? That really means thinking about how can we're not asking you to be mental health providers, but what can you do to help promote resilience in our students? Because the one thing we do know, there's that sense our kids have run out of resilience, but we know that resilience can be fostered and developed. And so how can we provide sources of support to bolster the resilience that your students have?
So our model of fostering resilience really comes from the ARC model. It's a clinical but also psychoeducational approach to really fostering resilience through what we have sort of coined as the 3 C's of resilience. So this may look familiar to you, and we want to kind of talk about them in the context of returning to school, post mid, I don't know where we're at in the pandemic, but the 3 C's being connection, coping, and competence. And so we're going to kind of walk you through each of these to just give you a sense of like, yeah, I'm not this kid's therapist. I'm not going into this classroom to do group therapy. I'm not even, I'm not a mental health provider. I'm an educator. But what are some things I can be looking for, some opportunities I might have to really foster resilience, create that safety, promote learning during this, pretty difficult time for a lot of kids.
So to speak about the first C of connection, one of the things we know, right, is that particularly, all of us, all humans, we are hardwired for connection. We need that connection. But in particular, adolescents really are craving that connection, right? We know that that social emotional connection trumps everything else for an adolescent. That is their driving kind of force is to really feel deeply connected to others. And so we want to really emphasize that the connection is not something to do only in the beginning of the year. I think many educators, sometimes focus on, we're going to spend a couple of weeks connection over content, really getting to know our kids, and we're going to be really intentional for the first 3 weeks. And then we've got all of these concerns of all the content I have to get through the year. But what we know is that while we want to prioritize that first couple of weeks of getting to know kids, that emphasis on connection really needs to happen all year long. So you're going to constantly be thinking about how can I build connection into any of the activities that I do. Often when we work with secondary educators, we really talk about utilizing connection circles. And so if you've been in space with us in person, you know about those connection circles, and we encourage using them on a regular basis. Some educators use them every day, quick connection circle, so that they can hold that space and build those relationships. We also recognize the importance of being engaged and actively listening with our students and one another. So kids need to feel seen and heard. Often that's one of, it's funny, I'm the parent of 2 middle school children. And sometimes my son says to me, like, Mama, just listen. And I'm going to stop because he just needs to be heard. And that is a really important part of listening, engaging, and listening to understand, not us listening to respond. Sometimes I call it, we ask questions, a teacher question. If there's an answer we're looking for, we're trying to draw out of our students, but instead really listening to learn something new about what your students are bringing into the space, not listening for that answer related to content. We also want to think about the kind of questions that we ask. And so really being aware of how do we intentionally seek to know our students without asking questions that escalate the level of risk. So we wouldn't want to ask questions about, how many, trying to build connection, we might, inadvertently cause harm if we ask students to talk about how many of you lost a loved one, for example, during COVID-19, because having to share that in a space that doesn't feel safe may not be helpful for a student, but not shutting them down either if they want to offer that information. So really being aware of, we hold up what has happened to you, we ask questions and we listen, but we also don't put a child in a space that they feel that they need to disclose something that they're not prepared to disclose. We don't want to open them up in a way that we can't offer the proper containment. So thinking about those things. And then storytelling. We tell stories because they allow us to be seen, to be heard, to really feel like we matter. And storytelling also allows us to make sense of our experience. So when we think about the impact of trauma on a child's developing brain, on an adolescent, the opportunity to engage in narrative, to put meaning and make sense and create a linear context is really important too. And so thinking about how do we provide those opportunities within our curriculum and our content to engage in storytelling, but also in a way that we're still aware of how do we create a safe container for that to happen.
Storytelling really goes so well too with coping, because coping is really about self and co-regulation. And if you think about that window of tolerance and what you sometimes need to stay within it, sometimes we need someone else with us, to stay in that window of tolerance. And sometimes we need to just get our feelings out. And so, this skill of coping has kind of, a few different pieces that we can really support kids and ourselves and each other, in the ways that we do them. So the first being emotional identification. One of the things we know is that a lot of us have a fairly limited emotional vocabulary, and it's not something that we've all been taught. There are so many words for emotions out there, and they're all meant to be used because we all have, we all may experience one of them at some point. And so really supporting, when kids are talking about their feelings, identifying their feelings, or aren't sure how to describe how they feel, right? Being a co-regulator sometimes means like, actually, I know you're crying and you're telling me you're having a hard time describing how you're feeling. I wonder if you're feeling sad or hurt right now, based on what I'm seeing on your face and your tone of voice, right? But these are things, we think about often doing with really young kids, but often older kids need them and often adults need them too, because we do just sometimes, especially in moments of stress, have a hard time coming up with those words. Emotional expression is so important too, and storytelling can be such a beautiful way to do that, especially in connection with someone you trust, to really just be able to tell your story, to talk it through without, someone interrupting you or adding their story to the mix, but just to do some of that mindful or dyadic listening that maybe some of you have done with us throughout the year in other workshops. Emotional expression really requires safety, to really just be able to put it out there. And often it can be hard to know how to put it out there. So we can give kids ideas about what might work to get their feelings out. Maybe it is telling a story. Maybe it's writing something down. Maybe it's, helping them down the hall to get to art class where they're going to be able to express that in some way. Maybe, it's making sure that they get that, therapy referral because you're noticing that this is coming up a lot for them. And then we want to get to that third piece. And this is really where that co-regulation can be really helpful, because sometimes it's really hard to do this all on your own, where you need to, you're at a 10 and you need to get down to a 7 at least, right, to get back to math class. And if you're feeling that angry, or maybe you're at a 7 and you need to get down to a 4. And just even having that language around sort of the intensity of what you're feeling, where it's happening in your body, and then how do you regulate it. So as the adults in buildings, a lot of times we can model this through our own regulation practices in the classroom. So you can, you might maybe come in a rush and kind of stress yourself and just say, I'm going to take a few deep breaths before I start our lesson today. I'm feeling a little, panicky right now. Feeling a little anxious. You modeling your own emotions, your own way of expressing and your own way of regulating is a really powerful step for your own self-care, first of all, but it's also a powerful way of learning for the students and others who might observe you.
The third C that we're really thinking about is competence. And competence is really, that experience that happens when you are successfully able to navigate difficulties. You feel competent and you feel accomplished. And one of the things that we know, particularly for adolescents, that self-efficacy and that competency and that knowledge that you can have an impact on the world, that you can do hard things successfully is so critical for our adolescents. And yet we know that we have this narrative that is happening right now that's coming directly from COVID-19, which is this sense of these kids are so far behind, right? We hear it over and over. Students are hearing it on the news. They hear it from teachers. They hear it from their families. The sense of urgency of like, my kids lost so much time. They've lost so much. They're not going to make gains. And we want to put that into some context, because one of the things that's important to recognize is that often students, there's a number of students that are already behind and are already playing catch up, but staying in that space of being so far behind is one of the driving forces that is fueling that anxiety, that depression, that suicide ideation for young people, that sense that I can't get out of this. And we know that's not true. We want to really lean into a strength-based approach. There's a middle school that I worked with all this year during the pandemic, and they had really remarkable gains and progress made in both math and literacy for their students, even in the pandemic. So we know that, yes, that's a narrative, and we know kids are behind, and we also know that they can catch up and they can grow. And we really want to focus on how do we have that challenge, that deficit mindset, or that thinking, there's been some losses academically in the year, but we have not thrown away a child's whole academic career. And I say that because it's really important that we sit in that place. It's also really important that we challenge any deficit mindsets that are happening toward families and caregivers who really were doing the best that they could in this pandemic. But there is that narrative that sometimes happens, that parents or caregivers didn't care about their child's education last year because maybe their child didn't sign on to the remote learning or whatever it might be. And just really having grace and compassion for the situation that parents were at. Another middle school that I was supporting, there was a situation where teachers were like, these kids are logging in at like midnight. They don't have good boundaries. And why are they? And we reshifted. They're logging in at midnight probably because they don't have access. They're sharing a device with their family, but they care enough to actually want to get their work done. And that's a strength-based approach. And we wish they weren't working in the middle of the night, but really looking at what are the ways that we see kids showing up as best they can in families. And also having that sense of competence for educators as well, that our educators have been taxed in ways. So your cooperating teacher might be entering space really reeling from a very difficult year that they were asked to do, to show up and teach in ways that they maybe had not been asked to do before. And so really having that strength-based approach and recognizing that we really don't want to land in that place of hopelessness.
such a good point, Ellie. We just hear that so much from teachers this year, that this feeling of competence, has been so hard to find some days. So I want to just end by, just walking through some of this context that we're facing right now, that you may be facing as you enter a new school as a pre-service teacher, and sort of how do you approach this? You're, understanding the new processes with your mentor teacher, a new classroom, a larger school system. So just some thoughts around how to enter a space and kind of first get to know those, of course, the mentor teacher, start to understand the context of the school and the district, maybe spending some time looking up, have there been, any of those Chalkbee articles about this school or this district over the last couple of years? What was the school's plan last year? Were kids hybrid and then remote and then back in person? Like, how did all of that go last year? And what are kids coming in with, as far as their experience of that? Getting to know those internal systems, right? And how you access support for students. So start, if there's, some of those introductory meetings, or if you can get a list of resources, but figuring out so that, when a student does ask you or tell you something that, indicates they might need some extra support, that you have some sense of where to go. Really being willing to ask for help. And I think, hopefully that's welcomed and just easy to find, but even if not, to really remind yourself, right? You're going to need help this year. You're going to need to be able to ask for support and build those relationships where that's welcomed and supported, and if not, in the places that you need it, like where else do you find it? And then just a reminder too that, you don't have to have all of the shared experiences of your students to empathize with them. I think sometimes we feel like, gosh, I could never, you just don't even know what that would be like. And that's okay. There's no way we can all have each other's same experiences, right? Let's just maybe start with not making assumptions and just asking questions and getting to know more before we, take that next step, whatever it is. So back to that cultural humility piece of just willing to hear and be changed, by information that comes to you. These are just, some of our sort of, thoughts around how to bring this trauma-informed cultural humility approach to a new school environment, in the role you're going in, given the context of the last year. And I'm sure there's much more to consider, but just wanted to leave you with that piece.
Our last piece to name and acknowledge is that being invited into a classroom for a field placement or for your student teaching, it can bring up a lot of feelings. It really can. So excitement and worry and anxiety and curiosity and being nervous and kind of a whole host of emotions. And we also want to name and normalize that there are going to be amazing things about this year. And they're going to be things that feel really challenging. So those highs and lows are appropriate. But if we understand that biological response to stress and trauma and understand and contextualize that, and really enter your classrooms with a lens of cultural humility. So really being open to that lifelong learning and thinking about how do I challenge current balances that might show up, and how do I think about an education as an opportunity to promote institutional accountability from your students. So kind of all of those things and being aware of how you show up on your own are key factors that are really going to allow you to lean into the resiliency that you have to really show up as the most engaging teacher that you can be, and really offer that gift to the students and families that you'll be serving. So we're going to pause now and open up to questions that you might have. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, keep this up. Any questions?
There are no questions, Ellie.
Okay. So with that said, since there are no questions, we just thank you for your time and hope that this content has helped prepare you a little bit more for the upcoming year. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.